Howdy, howdy. So, welcome to another Boost Question Quick Clip. My name is Abigail Petronelli, and today's lecture quick clip video is going to be on discontinuous measures. Specifically, this is meant to address the 6th edition TCO C.6, which is designing and applying discontinuous measurement procedures. So, things like interval recording, time sampling, etc. So, that is our topic for today. So, on to the question. So here is our question. So the table below measures the occurrence of vocal stereotypy across 10 intervals. The gray shading indicates the behavior is occurring. If the behavior analyst were using momentary time sampling, what would be the percentage of occurrence? And then we see the table here, and our answer choices A, 50%, B, 40%, C, 70%, and D, 30%. So in this video, I'm going to first start off by analyzing the question itself, so determining, okay, what is this question exactly asking us to do, and then actually going over the concepts and terminology and how to actually calculate it and the different answer choices. So it's going to be pretty clear pretty quickly what the correct answer is. So I would encourage you, before we move forward, to go ahead and try and answer this question yourself, just by means of comparison to see, hey, did you get the question right or wrong? And then you can kind of determine, okay, well, why did I get that question wrong if you did? And then if you got it right and you're like, I'm not entirely sure why I got that right, you can understand why as well. So if you need some extra time, go ahead and pause the video, but I'm going to go ahead and start with analyzing the question itself. Again, part of answering multiple choice questions is determining, okay, what is this question asking me to do? Because a lot of times these questions have a bunch of different content within them, and you could still get a question wrong even understanding all the concepts because maybe you weren't clear on what it was actually asking, or your answer didn't actually address what the question was asking specifically. So again, our question here. Again, looking at the last line of the question, we see that this question is asking us to focus in and calculate using momentary time sampling. Okay, so we have that down pat. And then we want to look at the percentage of occurrence. Now, that may seem pretty obvious, right? But sometimes you'll see questions where they'll say percentage of non-occurrence, and you may accidentally get the wrong answer because you were focusing on occurrence. So just paying attention to small details like that are really important because, again, those are pretty critical details here. So we want to calculate the percentage of occurrence using momentary time sampling. And again, analyzing the table, because again, if we can't correctly interpret the table, we're not going to be able to get the correct answer. We need to see what it's showcasing, right? And as it described, it said that the gray bars indicate that behavior is occurring, and so then the white bars are behavior is not occurring. So we can see across these different intervals that some of them are shaded, some of them are fully shaded, some of them are partially shaded, and that's just indicating behavior is occurring or not. So we see, for example, in interval 4, I believe it said these were 10-second intervals, so it's occurring for about half of it, so it's probably that vocal stereotypy was occurring for about 5 seconds and then stopped. And maybe in interval 7, this is maybe 1 to 2 seconds. I don't have any precise data here, but a very brief point in the interval, vocal stereotypy occurred and then stopped for the rest of the interval. So it's important that we understand what this graph is trying to tell us and the information from it so that we can then go forth and actually calculate it, which is what the question wants us to do. So that being said, let's go ahead and break down the concepts themselves. Again, it's going to be pretty clear pretty quickly what the correct answer is once we get to it, because I'm going to talk about the concepts generally and then going forward and calculating depending on the discontinuous measure. So again, this question is asking about momentary time sampling. What is it? Well, it is a type of discontinuous measurement approach, right? So remember, with discontinuous measurement, it's just trying to get a kind of a sample of the data, right? Maybe you don't have enough time or the availability to collect continuous data all the time, right? So this is trying to just get you, and momentary time sampling and other discontinuous measurement procedures are just trying to get a sample of how often this behavior may be occurring, right? So it's just an estimate, if anything. With momentary time sampling, behavior is marked having as occurred if it was present at a specific point in the interval. Typically, this is at the very end of the interval. I have seen it where it's been at the very beginning, but more often than not, it's at the very end of the interval. In layman's terms, during each interval, you wait we'll just say maybe 10 seconds, and at the last second, you look up, and if the behavior is occurring or not, if it's occurring, you mark it as a yes. If it's not, mark it as a no. So again, in that 10-second interval, it doesn't matter if that behavior was occurring for the 9 seconds before. If you look up at the last second and it's not occurring, you mark it as a no. So it's just looking at that very specific point in the interval, again, typically the last second, and then to see if the behavior is occurring. If it is at that point, mark it as yes. If not, it would be a no, no matter what else was going on in that interval prior to that. However, there are, of course, other types of discontinuous measurement procedures. So planned activity check or play check is one. It's actually an approach to momentary time sampling. It's just used with groups, right? And so in a play check, you typically have a group of individuals, maybe 10 students, and you're trying to see who's on task, right? So at the end of, we'll say, the 10-second interval, you look up, you see 3 students doing the work task, you write down 3. So you're counting the number of individuals engaging in the behavior at the end of the interval. So play check is a form of momentary time sampling, just with groups. Partial interval is another common discontinuous measurement approach in which you mark behavior having as occurred if it was present at any point in the interval. So beginning, middle, end. If it occurred at some point in the interval, you mark it as a yes. So it could have occurred for half a second. The fact that it occurred in the interval, you mark it as a yes. So it tends to overestimate behavior. For whole interval recording, behavior must occur for the entire interval to be marked as a yes. So it has to occur, for example, in the entirety of the 10 seconds. Doesn't matter if it occurred for 9 seconds, because it wasn't the entire 10 seconds, you would mark it as a no. So whole interval tends to underestimate. So partial, you mark it as yes if it occurred at all. Whole, it has to occur the entire interval. And then momentary time sampling, it has to occur at the specific point in the interval, again, usually the end. So discriminating between these different types of discontinuous procedures are really important, because when you're doing discontinuous measurement and making those calculations of occurrence, what that number you're going to get is going to differ depending on the method you use. So if you take a data set and you apply a whole interval approach or a partial interval approach or a momentary time sampling approach, even if it's with the same data, you are likely to get a different percentage of occurrence depending on how you calculate it. And so that's what this question is really getting to, right? So we have this sample data here, and we're trying to assess, using momentary time sampling specifically, what the percentage of occurrence is. And so let's actually go through that. So here's our table here. So interval 1, it's occurring at the very end of the interval, so we'll mark it as yes. Same thing with interval 2 and 3. For interval 4, though, yeah, it's occurring for the first 5 seconds, but it is not at the last 5 seconds, right? So at that very last second, it's not occurring. So we would actually mark this as a no if we're scoring this on momentary time sampling procedures. Same thing with interval 5 and 6, it's not occurring at all, so we're going to mark that as a no. Interval 7, really similar approach to interval 4, right? Just because it's occurring at some point in the interval, it's not occurring at the very end, so we would mark this as a no, right? If this little instance of behavior were towards the very end at that last second, at that point we would mark it as yes, but because it isn't, we would score this as a no. Interval 8, though, we would score because, again, it's at the very last second. It's at the end of the interval. We looked up and that vocal stereotypy was occurring, so we would mark this as a yes. Same thing for interval 9, and then interval 10 has nothing, right? And so when we're calculating percent occurrence, what we're going to do is we'll count the number of pluses and divide them over the total number of intervals. So here we have 5 over the 10 total intervals, so we have a 50% occurrence using momentary time sampling. Now, how would this differ if we used partial interval recording? Again, this is not what the question was asking about, but let's just showcase how we get different calculations even within the same data set, right? So if we were going to calculate this using partial interval recording, interval 1, 2, and 3 would all be yeses, right? Because it's occurring for the entire interval. It's occurring for some part of the interval, but whether it's occurring for just a second, half a second, or the entire 10 seconds, doesn't matter. We would mark them as a yes. Same thing with interval 4, right? In this case, it occurred for probably about 5 seconds. The fact it occurred at all, we would mark it as yes, as a plus, or as a check in some instances. Interval 5 and 6 don't have any occurrence of behavior at all, so we would mark that as a no. Interval 7, we would mark as a yes, because again, it's occurring at some point in the interval, whereas in momentary time sampling, we would score this and interval 4 as a no. In partial interval, the fact that it occurred at all, you mark that as a yes for that specific interval. Interval 8 would also be a yes, because again, it's occurring at some point in the interval. Just at this point, it's just at the very end of the interval. Would still count, so we'd still mark that as a yes. Same for interval 9. Interval 10, no behavior occurring, so we'd mark that as a no. But again, we'll count the number of yeses over the total of 10, and you actually get 70%. So even with the same data set, just using a different discontinuous measure, we got a totally different percent occurrence. And finally, whole interval. What would this look like? What would the percentage of occurrence be if we calculated the same set of data with whole interval recording? Well, for intervals 1, 2, and 3, they're occurring for the entirety of the intervals. So they would all be marked as a yes, as a plus. Interval 4 would not be. be marked as a no, because again, it's not occurring for the entirety of the interval. For whole interval, you mark it as a yes if it occurs for the entirety of the interval. So in this case, for the entirety of the 10 seconds. Intervals 1 through 3, it occurred the entire 10 seconds, so you're good on those. But interval 4, you'd mark it as a no. 5 and 6 are obviously blank, so we're going to mark those as no. Interval 7, also no, because again, it's not occurring for the entirety of the interval, so it's a no. Same with interval 8. So again, this is where you're going to see those differences from momentary time sampling and whole interval, right? So in our momentary time sampling calculation, this was a yes because it occurred at the very end. But because whole interval requires the behavior to occur for the entire interval, you mark it as a no. Interval 9 is occurring for the entire 10 seconds, so we'd mark that as a yes. And interval 10 has no behavior occurring within that 10-second period, so we'd mark that as a no. So again, we're going to calculate it over the total number of intervals, and we actually get 40%, so even a totally different number from partial interval recording. So in this question, 50% would be the correct answer. So if you used momentary time sampling, you'd get 5 out of the 10 intervals was the behavior occurring again, intervals 1, 2, 3, 8, and 9, right? So 50% is our correct answer here. 40% would better align if you were trying to calculate it using whole interval recording, 70% for partial interval, 30% may be the answer if you were trying to calculate non-occurrence by some measure, right? Because you see 3 blank intervals, right? Intervals 5, 6, and 10 have no behavior occurring at all. But in this case, the correct answer is 50%. So if you got this question wrong or you struggled with this item, you may need to review the 6th edition TCO C.6, reviewing those differences between the different types of discontinuous measures, so between momentary time sampling, whole interval, partial interval, and just practicing calculating percentage of occurrence across those different measurement procedures, even within the same data set. So if you need some extra practice, please go ahead and take the supplemental quiz that goes along with this video and check out some additional resources to help you with your studying. Thank you so much. I hope this was helpful.